Hey everyone, welcome back to Melody Ever After. A lot of you are probably wondering what's Melody up to. Like, she's usually like super annoying and loud and obnoxious. And today I decided we're going to tone things down a little bit. It's a lot for me. And we're going to be talking about 3 true Reddit stories that are downright horrifying. First things first, I want to say that I've gotten permission from all of these accounts to use their stories in my YouTube video, and I just want to say thank you to all of these creators, and I'm going to be reading them exactly as written. If there is a typo, I'm going to interject and say what I think was supposed to be said, but I'm going to be reading these exactly as written, and we're going to be talking about some theories about what these scary stories could have been if we think they're true. Just open up the conversation for some more paranormal action. Even though I have 3 wonderful stories lined up for you guys, I would love to know which one is your favorite, so be sure to listen to all of them. I have saved my very favorite for last. I do believe it is the most crazy story I've ever heard on Reddit, and I cannot wait to share it with you guys. So hang in there and let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Without further ado, let's get started with our first story. This story is called Something in the Woods Tonight. It was posted by a user called Jive of Turkey, and it was posted in the r/paranormal subreddit. This was the one that originally caught my attention. Something in the Woods Tonight by Jive of Turkey. I figured I'd post this here to get some thoughts after I've terrified my wife. I want to preface that I have hunted and hiked this region since I was 9 years old. I'm very familiar with the wildlife and sounds of the forest. I'm not really a believer of this sort of thing, and I don't really have an explanation for what happened tonight. I hiked about 1.5 miles through the forest and swamp hunting deer today, and got to a pocket of the woods in the field that I wanted to be in and climbed a tree to hunt out of. By all accounts, this was an uneventful afternoon and evening until sundown. For about 30 straight minutes, I listened to a rabbit be tortured and just wouldn't die. If you've heard a dog or a hawk get a rabbit or hunted rabbits, you know what I'm talking about. That is a horrifying sound. That is the worst sound in the world, to hear a rabbit die. Probably right in front of hearing coyote pups in the woods in the dead of night. That is like the second worst sound in the world. When they are distressed, they scream bloody murder, and this just seemed to continue forever. Naturally, this can make you on edge, but I figured a hawk got it and just wasn't killing it. Then, the sound of a twig snapping, and then silence. The rabbit stopped. Through the thicket, I could make out a figure, vaguely deer-shaped, moving through the woods about 35 yards away, so I grabbed my bow. The undergrowth is far too thick for me to pick out much more than a rough outline. The sun is now fully set, and I am in the last 15 minutes of post-sundown light. And I hear a flat, emotionless child's voice coming from where that deer, quote-unquote, disappeared. Help, help, help. No fluctuation or distress in its voice. Not said as if it was asking for help, just a statement. Help, help, help. It probably said that 15 times, and then the woods went silent. There wasn't even a breeze to make a sound. Then, a crack of a limb and a tree snapping, and all hell broke loose in the woods. Squirrels, birds, and deer suddenly shot out of the woods like bats out of hell, sounding like an absolute stampede through the forest. And then, silence again. To make things worse for me, I had lost my hat-clipped light on my walk in. He's talking about a ball cap, probably with like a light attachment clipped to it, and had to haul ass 1.5 miles through the woods back to my truck in the darkness, my path only light by tonight's full moon. Update. I'm writing this sitting in my truck, just returned. I went back to the woods this morning to check things out, and I will make another post. I won't be going back there again. Then there is another update where another link is attached, and it says, I have attached a link to the first post from last night. This was posted in r/paranormal just like the last one. It's called Something in the Woods Last Night Update, and it reads, I went back to the woods this morning. Last night, after getting back to my truck, I called a few friends to let them know what happened, and then I had a relatively sleepless night. This morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided I need to return. I grabbed my hunting dog, called up a buddy to come with, and set out back to the woods. First, I drove around the property. Nobody was parked at any trailhead, so there couldn't have been anyone around. We took a long way around, heading north to get into the woods, a few miles from the parking area, stopping to talk, look for any animal signs, and listen as we go. We approached the woods from the south, keeping on the outside of it in a tall, grassy field. As we approached within 200 yards of where I had heard it last night, we stopped to talk for a moment and plan how to best go about entering the woods. This isn't some manicured forest that's easy walking. The undergrowth is dense and filled with those thorny shrubs and buckthorn. Whereas yesterday and in weeks past, the area was teeming with life, deer, pheasants, hundreds of turkeys, and their poults, crows, squirrels, and rabbits. Today the woods and fields were completely silent. As we discussed this, I realized that my dog was nowhere to be seen or heard. She normally wears a bell, or the metal pieces of her collar are sufficient for me to hear where she is. It is silent. She wears an e-collar that I can press a button on and it will make a beeping noise I can hear. I press the button in silence. I yelled for her in silence. Then coming from the forest ahead of me, I hear the yelping of my dog in pain, loud and clearly my dog. I look at my friend and then take off toward the woods, calling and beeping her collar and calling and beeping her collar and waiting back to silence. I look at my buddy and he asks, "What are you doing?" as if he hadn't heard it. We stop and wait a moment on the edge of the woods. I call one more time and finally hear the jingle of her collar coming up to me completely unharmed from the opposite direction of where I thought I heard her crying. Confused, we distanced ourselves from the woods and continued north along the edge. Again, we neither heard any or saw any wildlife. We found a few spots where things were recently killed, staining the ground with rotted blood, but no sign of anything living. Eventually, we turned back as we crossed the same spot that I thought I heard my dog, and my friend stopped, looked at me in panic, and said, "Oh shit, your dog," and started running off towards the woods. I called after him, asking what he was doing, and he said he had heard her crying in pain in the woods and was as confused when I said I had heard nothing, just the same as when we first walked by and I was the one who heard it. I could see my dog in the opposite direction, smelling around, totally unharmed. I called out to my friend that the dog is fine, it was over by me, and we rushed out. For those that might ask what else this may be, I have heard my dog yelping before. That was it. It doesn't sound like coyotes or wolves. I won't be returning to that area again. So that was Something in the Woods Tonight by Jive of Turkey. This is the first story that really caught my attention because growing up in the woods, this is really, really scary, especially because some of the scariest nights I've ever had in the woods are nights where I have gone deer hunting and I have came up on some stuff that I couldn't really make out what it was, and it was really hard for me to tell what I was looking at, and it was really cold and I was uncomfortable, and I know what it's like to feel that kind of sense of urgency in the woods, especially when you're trying to track down a deer or something like that as the sun's going down or even as it's dark. It's a really uneasy feeling, and some people it doesn't bother them, but I'm not one of those people. I like to have my deer completely hunted down, and that's why I do prefer to go deer hunting in the early hours of the morning instead of at night. I don't hunt anymore, but I always preferred to go early in the morning. That way it got brighter when it was time for me to find my deer versus getting darker when it was time for me to find my deer. This is a very freaky story. Of course, a lot of things that people think of when they hear these kinds of stories are flesh pedestrians. If you know, you know. Things like that, things that can imitate human voices, and you hear a lot of stories about imitating human voices, which I find really, really intriguing. One thing that has become really intriguing to me is that I have recently heard stories of crows imitating animals and imitating humans, and a lot of times these, birds of prey can start imitating humans and luring them off the path. I've heard stories of that happening. Since two people heard it, it makes me wonder if it was a mimicking kind of animal. This is a realistic perspective, makes me wonder if it was like a mimicking kind of animal. And then obviously the second option is that this is something paranormal going on, but that was Something in the Woods Tonight by Jive of Turkey. So shout out to Jive of Turkey. Thank you so much for letting me use your story. Again, I really appreciate it. This next story is posted by the Reddit user Subparadult, which same, I find that username really funny. And it was posted in r/True Scary Stories. And it comes from the Appalachian Mountains, which is a very spooky area. If if you're a horror fan and a cryptid fan, you know that the Appalachian Mountains, or Appalachia, is a very spooky, scary place. And I'm not from that area. I'm from kind of the Ozark area. And similar stuff kind of happens in the Ozark Mountains you hear about, but there's something absolutely haunting about Appalachia just because those mountains are so old and they have been there longer than the Rockies. The Smokies have been there longer than the Rockies, and it's just a web. So anything that happens in Appalachia is very intriguing to me. So big shout out to Subparadult. Now, because this was posted in r/True Scary Stories, and I noticed this story by Subparadult was also cross-posted in a couple of Reddit subreddits that are specifically for true paranormal, true scary stories, true experience subreddits. So based on that and my conversations that I have had with them in the DMs when I asked for permission to use this story, I am under the impression that this story is a personal experience of theirs, and I am supposed to be reading it from the perspective that it is a true story. But I will also say that with a little bit of looking at their account, they seem to be a pretty experienced author, and they do write a lot of other scary stories, so their writing style is a little bit more dramatized and intriguing than the typical experience story on Reddit. I will say that their writing style is a lot more imaginative and whimsical, and I don't necessarily think that that makes their story any less true. I'm just going to preface their story by saying that it is very stylized and their writing style is very calculated, but I don't think that makes their story any less true. I just believe that they are a very talented author. That being said, let's get into The Door by Subparadult from r/True Scary Stories. I lived in the Appalachian Mountains my whole life, where the woods are thick, tangled, and full of mystery. Growing up there felt like a step back in time. We had no cell phones or gadgets to distract us, just the endless expanse of the forest as our playground and our imagination as our guide. My best friend Madison and I would spend hours exploring the dense woods behind my house, following animal tracks, climbing trees, and discovering hidden creeks. In autumn, when the leaves turned fiery shades and fell, revealing clearer paths, we'd push a little deeper each day. We'd mark our quote-unquote bases in the most secret nooks we stumbled upon, pretending we were the first explorers to find them. But no matter how brave we felt, we always stayed close enough to see my house in the distance. Until one day, when the forest just felt a little bit more inviting, a little less ordinary, and the curiosity got the better of us. We brought twine and other supplies that day, winding it around tree trunks so that we'd find our way back. We kept walking deeper than we had ever gone before until we reached a strange old tree that was split in two, like a giant slingshot rising from the ground. Next to it, half hidden in the hillside beneath a pile of leaves and branches, was a rusty handle. As we brushed away the leaves, we realized it was attached to a heavy wooden door embedded in the earth as if it had always been there waiting. Heart pounding, Madison and I both tugged on the handle, and the door finally broke open, revealing steps leading down into pitch black darkness. Madison looked at me, unsure, but we felt compelled to go down. Maybe it was the mystery or the thrill of finding something forgotten, but we didn't hesitate. The air was thick and damp as we descended. As we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped room. In the middle of the floor lay a single worn photograph. I held it up to our flashlight and froze. It showed two children, both girls, standing in front of a house that looked eerily like mine. The girls' eyes were so dark, and their grins twisted a little too wide. Madison and I looked at each other, panicked, and then bolted back up the steps, leaving the photo behind us. When we reached the top, we looked around. Our path of twine was gone, as if someone or something had unraveled it. We blindly ran back through the forest, finally reaching my house. We burst through the front door, breathless and wide-eyed. My parents immediately noticed something was wrong. We tried to explain what we'd found. The strange door in the hillside, the steps, the photograph. My mother's face tightened with concern, but my dad, always the skeptic, shook his head and laughed. When he saw we were serious, they agreed to come with us, though I could tell they just thought it was an overactive kid's imagination. With my parents in tow, we spent what felt like hours retracing our steps in the wood, following what we remembered of the path. We finally spotted the twisted slingshot-shaped tree standing exactly where we had found it before. My heart leapt, but when we sourced the area around it, there was no sign of the door, no rusty handle, no disturbed leaves, just bare earth and untouched forest floor. It was like the whole thing never existed. My dad muttered something about kids and their stories, but as we walked back home, I caught a worried look in Mom's eyes. Madison and I exchanged a glance too, and in the moment we knew we experienced something no one would ever believe. Even now, 15 years later, Madison and I can't shake the memory of that day. We had gone back to those woods more than once trying to find any trace of the hidden door, but it's as if it never existed. We have no explanation for what we saw, no way to make sense of it, Every time I visit home and glance up into the wood, a chill creeps up my spine, and I almost expect to see the door waiting there, half buried and forgotten, just as we left it. And no matter how hard I try, I can still see that eerie photo in my mind. The eyes, the strange grin, it's like it's burned into my memory. So that was The Door by Subparadult. And I do think that was a very cinematic approach to true scary stories. I will say that there are a couple of different explanations I have come up with based on this story. I do think that there is a very large possibility that some of the details could be exaggerated by the fact that it was many years ago and that it was children experiencing this. That could be one of the explanations if we're looking at it from a realistic approach, as well as other explanations. They were lost and there were multiple slingshot-shaped trees. Growing up, there were several trees in my woods on the farm where I lived that had been struck by lightning or had rotted and split, so that's not exactly an uncommon thing. It is a little bit of a stretch to say, oh, there were 2 slingshot-shaped trees, but I will say that this is a very haunting story, and the way that it is written is very cinematic. Of course, it could be posted on True Scary Stories for publicity as a fictional narrative. That's another possibility. And then, of course, the last possibility is just those Appalachian Mountains. They're just scary. They're just spooky. There's weird stuff happening in those mountains all the time over in Tennessee and Kentucky, West Virginia. It's a really freaky place. Again, like I said, you couldn't find me. I will not be caught dead camping there. Actually, if you did catch me camping there, I probably would be dead because it is just too scary. It is too freaky, and I've heard way too many things about it. And the only person that I would ever go with camping there, I would have requirements. My husband would have to be there, and Wendigoon would have to be there. If I had the chance to camp in the Appalachian Mountains with Wendigoon, I don't think that I could pass that up. That'd be too fun. But overall, freaky stuff happens there, and that was an excellent story, regardless of if it is true or if it is exaggerated or if it's from your mind. Congratulations, Subparadult. That was a wonderfully written narrative, and that was absolutely spine-tingling, so shout out to you. Alright, our final and last entry is no shade to the other creators, but this one is my favorite, so I have saved the best for last. I want to say shout out to Pine-Devil, Pine Devil on Reddit. Thank you for giving me permission to use this story because it's awesome. This is the exact kind of stuff I love reading about, and I love absorbing in media. So basically this one is titled "Was Told to Cross Post Here, So Enjoy," because I actually found it on r/crawler sightings. This is a subreddit for crawlers, which are cryptids or just unidentified creatures. A lot of times they look like the rake or gnome-like creatures, humanoids that are spotted, and people post evidence of crawler sightings on this subreddit. And this was cross-posted here as a story. I don't know what the original one was called. I don't see a link to it, but essentially this is going to be a national park story. Yay! Everybody cheer, everybody clap. Thank you, Pine Devil. We all love a national park story. So without further ado, let's get started. So this story is weird. Not because of the contents, but because the settings sound like something from a bad, cliche Skinwalker story. But regardless, it isn't the typical. I hope you enjoy it. I was a park ranger in the southern US, and my park was known for its caverns and its springs that made for excellent fishing. I began my work there as a tour guide and a groundskeeper. This would often culminate in me taking people on cave tours and helping people find their way on hiking trails, etc. The weird stuff started in the month of October, when during the routine maintenance of the cave's lighting system, you would feel eyes on you. You could sometimes even hear the sound of feet slapping the wet floor occasionally. I really didn't enjoy having to change the light bulbs for that reason. That being said, there was a phenomenon that when you would be closing up the museum and gift shop for the night, you could hear voices. A few times it would sound like guests, which I could explain away. But during one night, I could hear someone speaking on the second story of the museum. Kind of irritated, I walked up there to let the guests know that the park was shutting down for the night and that they would have to head back to the campgrounds. However, it was pitch black the moment I got up the stairs, and I couldn't hear anyone talking anymore as I made my way through the museum toward the balcony area. About the moment I had crossed the threshold, I heard something hit the trees outside and tear through the underbrush. I don't know about this. Could have been a raccoon or something, but it was certainly odd. Many times, walking just through the trails from base to other resting points and ranger huts, you would sometimes hear this meow that sounded off. It sounded off because it was a weird Chinese motion sensor we had in the ranger station to let others know if someone was trying to sneak in and steal things during the park hours. When I first read this story, I thought this was going to be a copycat of Stairs in the Woods that has been narrated all over Reddit, narrated on YouTube, and most popularly probably narrated by Wendigoon and Papa Meat, aka Meat Canyon, aka Hunter Hancock. They're some of my favorite YouTubers, and when I heard the meowing, I was like, this is going to be another meowing story. But actually, he's talking about one of those, like, probably motion sense waving cats that you see in the Chinese restaurants. Without further ado, I will continue. I just wanted to interject there and say that I was a little bit confused when I read that part. He's talking about those little interactive cat motion sensor things. It sounded off because it was a weird Chinese motion sensor we had in the ranger station to let others know if someone was trying to sneak in and steal things during the park hours. The strange part is that this meow would be heard just in the tree line, literally miles from my station. Keep in mind that no other stations had this motion sensor. It was a running joke with other stations about the awful motion sensor. It was bizarre, and the sound would move around you in circles as you hiked. During the rainy season was when it seemed to get worse. I suppose when the caves would flood and push whatever thing was living in the deeper unexplored parts out into the tourist areas, I would often hear other rangers' voices from the areas that were closed off for flooding. These areas were literally inaccessible because of 10 or so feet of water. On one occasion, I was leading my tour through these caves, and I heard a very close friend of mine ask me, "Hey, would you mind coming over here and helping me?" from a closed off area. The room was dark, half flooded, and it seemed like even the people on tour knew that. I could see the color leave their faces. We'd explained it to people thoroughly that some areas were literally inaccessible due to flooding beforehand. Against my better judgment, I left my group. I made sure the lights were bright, and I decided what were done wet pants. I believe what that last sentence was trying to say is that his pants were already wet, so he decided to go in because it was already flooded. And so going into the flooded room, he thought the pants are already wet. I'm just going to go in. There's probably a typo in there, but I can't really identify it. But I believe what he's trying to say is that his pants were already wet from the flooding. So, maybe they were wet because he's better than me, because if it were me in that situation, my pants would be wet because I would be scared and I would have peed myself. I made sure the lights were bright, and I decided what were done wet pants. I went in and swept the light around, but when I say this room is massive, I mean it. I heard one slosh, and that was just about all I could justify being around for. The water was dark and cold, and the room was so vast my terrible mag light was being eaten by the dark. I made the rest of my tour fast and got back to the surface, went back to the ranger station and asked them where my coworker was. My receptionist casually told me that he had clocked out an hour ago before my tour even began. Oh my god. I forgot about that part. That freaks me out really bad. That really, really freaks me out. Another notable experience was when I had gone down the crawl space of the museum once to get more weed whacker string. I was sitting there in the musty cobblestone basement that spanned under the 1800s massive building with a dirt floor and multiple stone columns running the length of the quote-unquote crawl space. Trying to untangle this weed whacker string, I had heard from farther in the basement someone do the cliche psst. Weirdly enough, I guess I hadn't put it together, so I spoke back, "What do you need?" somehow thinking it was a coworker or something. "Come back here." It was probably the creepiest thing I had ever heard. Oh my god, bro. I'm about to run outside, and I have my ring light on, but I'm actually filming with the lights off, and this story freaks me out so bad, dude. Oh, okay. Come back here. It was probably the creepiest thing I've ever heard. I'm not going to give you the quote-unquote something sounded off and I can explain it spill. The reason it sounded off is because it sounded like the way crows mimic people's speech. That low, weirdly chortling way they sound. I couldn't see what was talking to me, so I simply grabbed my weed whacker string and hurried up the crawl space door. Shutting it, I definitely had that feeling of something rushing up behind it before I locked the door. Ugh. Some weird, possibly related things was when I asked the senior ranger about it, he said, "Don't worry about it, it happens." As well as we had a weird string of findings of empty baby carriages and clothes up in the trees or at the bottom of gulches, and a man had claimed he had saw a mermaid in one of the local springs. Another time, some other man insisted on concerning me and screaming at me that the devil lived in these caves. Oh my gosh, that's horrifying. There was also a metric ton of caves in the park that were still active that we didn't take tours through. One I heard rumors about had apparently had crabs or other little microbes in it from prehistoric times. Eavesdropped on 2 university people talking to a senior. There was one that local teens made out in that had a massive drop-off into a sinkhole that it was apparently rumored to be where Confederate gold was hidden. Another had a ton of pottery and arrowheads in it, very interesting from an anthropology standpoint. These were weird times in my life, and the park, while I won't name it, had a wonderful vibe of mystery and wonder to it, although a few years later, half of the staff was laid off for selling the native pottery and stuff illegally. So as you can imagine, I'm glad I moved on in time to avoid that garbage. I'm not necessarily trying to convince anyone of anything, I'm just sharing some weird experiences. I hope you enjoy them. Thank you so much, Pine Devil, for allowing me to narrate your story. That was incredible. I think that out of all 3, that story is definitely the most convincing. The little tiny details of how they were getting weed whacker string. Overall, this just feels like a very genuine story because it's not exactly linear. It's just some random encounters that this person experienced, and overall, it freaks me out. This is one of the freakiest stories I've ever read on Reddit, just because it sounds like it's probably the most true. And a big round of applause for Pine Devil, because that was awesome. This has been 3 scary stories on Melody Ever After. They are from Reddit. They are all supposedly true, and I want to know what you think in the comment section. Again, big thank you to everyone who allowed me to narrate your story. If you have a story or an experience you want to share with me, you can send it to my email at MelodyEverAfter02@gmail.com, and I would love to start narrating these more. You're watching Melody Ever After. Until next time.